Welcome to Study Smart, the weekly show for wine students who want to take their wine education to the next level. I'm your host, Gill Gordon Smith, and in this episode we're breaking down another important wine region. With exam strategies and techniques to help you reach the next level in your wine education, this is Study Smart. Hello and welcome again to Study Smarter. In this episode, we're exploring Beaujolais, one of France's most misunderstood wine regions. Many people immediately think of Beaujolais Nouveau, but this region is capable of producing everything from bright, juicy, early drinking wines to some of the finest and most age-worthy expressions of Gamay in the world. And it's one of my favourite drinks. So over the next 10 minutes, we'll build a clearer picture of the region. We'll look at its geography, its climate, its appellation hierarchy, vineyard practices, and most importantly, the winemaking techniques. So we'll finish by linking everything together so it's easier to remember for your exam. So you might want to find Beaujolais on a map. It sits immediately south of Burgundy and stretches for around 55 kilometres from north to south. And although it's often grouped with Burgundy, it has its own identity and is planted predominantly to Gamay. The Saône River forms the eastern boundary and has a moderating influence on the vineyards here. The climate is predominantly continental, although the southern part of the region also receives some warmer Mediterranean influence. The warm summers usually allow Gamay to ripen reliably, while spring frosts and summer hail remain the principal vineyard hazards here. The landscape changes noticeably as you travel north. The south and the east are flatter. They have really fertile alluvial soils along the river. And these deeper soils encourage higher yields and earlier ripening. In contrast, the north and the west become hillier. They're dominated by granite and schist soils. And these porous soils naturally reduce the vine vigor and produce smaller berries with greater concentration, structure, and complexity. And it's this change in soils explains why the styles of Beaujolais become more serious as you travel north. There's a real difference in the appellation hierarchy here. So most Beaujolais and Beaujolais Nouveau comes from the fertile alluvial plains in the south and the east. And these vineyards are ideal for producing fresh, fruity wines designed to be enjoyed young. Above this in the hierarchy sits Beaujolais Village. So there's 39 villages that are entitled to use this appellation, and producers may also include the individual village names on the label. So these vineyards are generally located further north on the poorer granite soils. So the wines they produce have greater concentration and complexity. And right at the top of the hierarchy are the 10 Cru Beaujolais appellations. So all are located in the granite hills of the north, and they produce the region's finest and longest lived wines. So the 4 crus with the greatest production are Brouilly, Morgon, Fleury, and Moulin-à-Vent. So it's worthwhile remembering that Beaujolais Nouveau is released on the 3rd Thursday of November. It's intended for immediate drinking and can't be sold after the following 31st of August. Importantly, the 10 Cru appellations can't be produced or sold as Beaujolais Nouveau. Of those mentioned 4 Cru Beaujolais appellations, Brouilly is probably the largest cru and generally produces fresh, approachable, fruit-driven wines. Morgon is one of my favourites, and that produces richer, more structured wines that can develop savoury Burgundian characters with age. Fleury is renowned for its floral, elegant and perfumed style, and Moulin-à-Vent is usually the most powerful, tannic and age-worthy of the crus. And remember, there are 10 crus. Probably an interesting idea to draw or write those 10 crus. It would be a good exercise. In the vineyard, Gamay is commonly trained as goblet or bush vine. So this traditional pruning system keeps the vines low to the ground, shades the bunches during the growing season, and is well suited to the steep slopes. It also allows for hand harvesting, which is particularly important where whole bunches are used during the fermentation. And that brings us to winemaking. Although Beaujolais is famous for its use of carbonic maceration, producers use several different techniques depending on the style they want to achieve. So many wines, particularly from the crus, are made using a traditional fermentation with crushed grapes. Crushing the fruit before fermentation allows for greater extraction of colour, tannin, and flavour. So it produces wines with more structure, complexity, and aging potential. So let's compare the three techniques you'll hear about most often, and that may be something you may have to explain in an exam. Carbonic maceration. Now, this uses whole, uncrushed bunches placed into a sealed tank filled with carbon dioxide. The fermentation begins inside each individual berry before the grapes are pressed. So the grape starts to break down from the inside. And this produces wines with very soft tannins, vibrant red fruit flavours, and distinctive floral and confectionery aromas. It's the technique that's most closely associated with Beaujolais Nouveau. The second technique is semi-carbonic maceration, and this is the most common method in Beaujolais and also begins with whole bunches, but no carbon dioxide is added. Instead, the weight of the grapes naturally crushes some berries at the bottom of the tank, and as these ferment, they release carbon dioxide, so they create a combination of intracellular fermentation in the intact berries and conventional fermentation in the crushed fruit. So the result is wines with bright fruit character, freshness, and a little more structure than fully carbonic wines. Whole bunch fermentation is different again. Whole bunches are added to a traditional fermentation, often alongside crushed fruit. So the stems remain with the grapes during fermentation, so that contributes lifted floral aromas, freshness, and sometimes a little extra tannin and spice. It shouldn't be confused with carbonic maceration because fermentation is still primarily the normal yeast-driven process rather than taking place inside the berries. So many producers, particularly in the 10 Crus, use one or a combination of these techniques to achieve the style they're seeking. Maturation is usually in older neutral oak barrels or concrete tanks because it's all about allowing the character of the Gamay grape and the individual vineyard to remain the focus. Students often confuse carbonic maceration, semi-carbonic maceration, and whole bunch fermentation because all of them involve whole bunches. So tip to remember, carbonic is added carbon dioxide. Semi-carbonic, the carbon dioxide is produced naturally, and in whole bunch fermentation, it's a conventional fermentation with whole intact bunches. If you remember that comparison, you'll be able to answer most questions with confidence. So for the exam, remember these points. Granite soils dominate the north and west and produce the Crus. Fertile alluvial soils dominate the south and east and produce most of the Beaujolais and Beaujolais Nouveau. 39 villages can use Beaujolais village appellation. Goblet or bush vine pruning is traditional. Semi-carbonic maceration is the most common technique, and the four largest Crus are Brouilly, Morgon, Fleury, and Moulin-à-Vent. So let's finish by linking everything together. Site influences the soil, and the fertile alluvial soils of the south and the east produce lighter, fruit-forward Beaujolais and most Beaujolais Nouveau. The granite and schist soils of the north and west naturally reduce vine vigour, producing wines with greater concentration, structure, and aging potential. And this is where you'll find Beaujolais Village and all the 10 Crus. Site influences the winemaking choices. So fruit from the flatter southern vineyards is often made using carbonic or semi-carbonic maceration to preserve the freshness and the vibrant fruit, particularly for Beaujolais Nouveau. Fruit from the Crus is frequently handled differently. So many producers use traditional crushed fruit fermentation and sometimes incorporate a proportion of whole bunches to build greater complexity, structure, and longevity. Older neutral oak or concrete is commonly used, so the vineyard character remains the focus. So the hierarchy is Beaujolais, Beaujolais Village, and then the 10 Crus. And as quality generally increases, so does the concentration, the complexity, and the aging potential. So the four major Crus, Brouilly, Morgon, Fleury, and Moulin-à-Vent. If you can link the site, soil, appellation, and winemaking technique, you'll find Beaujolais much easier to understand and recall. So thanks for listening to Study Smarter. In this part of the podcast, I'm talking about learning techniques. And here we're talking about elaboration, about going deeper than the facts and how that can help you. So far, we've explored how memory works, why forgetting matters, how focus works, why cramming often fails, and why mixing up topics helps, and why drawing can strengthen memory. So today we're going to go a bit deeper because remembering information is useful, But understanding it is where the real learning happens. So today's idea is this: memorizing tells you what, understanding tells you why. So the learners who ask why often learn more deeply than the learners who only memorize facts. This idea is called elaboration, which is just a fancy word for making information richer and more meaningful. So instead of just learning a fact, you connect it, you expand it and you question it and you build relationships around it. For example, instead of memorizing sleep helps memory, we're going to ask why. What happens in the brain during sleep? Why would getting good rest affect how I learn? How does that connect to exam performance? And now the fact becomes part of a bigger network, and bigger networks are easier to retrieve. Because your brain doesn't store information as neat little isolated boxes. It stores connected ideas. So the more meaningful connections you build, the stronger the memory becomes. So let's bust a myth. The myth is memorizing more facts means I'm learning more. Not necessarily. You can memorize something temporarily without truly understanding it. And when stress hits, that shallow memory often disappears quickly. So understanding creates stronger foundations. So think about building a house. Memorizing isolated facts is like stacking bricks. Elaboration is building the structure that holds them together, the cement. So without structure, the bricks don't help much. So here's your experiment for this week. Pick one topic you're learning, then ask, why does this happen? How does this work? What causes this? What would happen if this changed? How do I connect this to something I already know? And keep going until you hit something you can't explain clearly. And that's where your real learning begins. And if you can explain it simply, that's a strong sign you understand it. So the reflection challenge for this week, am I collecting facts or building understanding? Because deep learning's not about memorizing more, it's about making information meaningful enough to stay. So see you next week for another region and another Study Smarter tip. Thank you for listening to Study Smart. If you're ready to take your wine education to the next level, why not visit the Italian Wine Academy at italianwineacademy.org. Don't forget to tune in next week when we'll be exploring another important wine region. Until then, chin chin with the Italian wine people.